Hello, and welcome to APICS Extra Live, Cycle Counting, Measurement versus Control with Andrew Stein. My name's Christopher Jablonski, Staff Editor with APICS. Before we begin, I'd like to run through a few details. At the end of the presentation, we'll save time for a question and answer session. If you look at the right toolbar on your screen, you'll see a questions box. To ask your question at any time during the presentation, simply type it in the box and click Send. Should you experience any technical difficulties during today's broadcast, please call GoToWebinar support at 1-805-617-7000. This presentation is being recorded and will be available at apics.org/extralive starting early next week. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's broadcast. Andrew C. Stein, CPIM, is a Senior Supervisor at Caterpillar. He has more than 15 years of supply chain experience and has been involved with record accuracy in a variety of roles, including Six Sigma Black Belt and Supervisor of Record Accuracy teams. So everybody, please give a warm welcome to Andrew. And Andrew, you may begin.
All right, thanks, Chris, and welcome everybody. As Chris mentioned, we are going to be talking about cycle counting and the difference between measurement and control. Just on the first introduction slide here, you can see my credentials. I'm not going to go through all of that, but yeah, I have been at Caterpillar over 19 years now, getting closer to 20 all the time here, and the majority of that time I've spent in various roles in our record accuracy management group. So I have quite a bit of experience both internal to Caterpillar as well as external with clients that we had worked with in the past. So, and also I've been involved with APICS since 2009 and have been certified as CPIM since then. So, and Chris doesn't seem to be working when I'm trying to go to the next page. All right, thank you. Our agenda, I'm going to talk about measurement versus control and explain what the difference is between those and why it's important to know the difference. I'm then going to move on to something I discussed briefly in the article, and that was a paradigm shift where we're trying to move the needle from our cycle counts or a cost driver to the company, and what you want to shift that over to is that your cycle counts actually add value and are a differentiator for you. We'll move on to the purpose of cycle counting. Okay, and now it's jumping ahead for me.
Sorry, I think that was me. If you want to click in the middle of your screen, that might give you control back.
Okay. Okay. There we go. Okay. Thanks, Chris. And yeah, so then we'll move on to the basic purpose of cycle counting, talk about that a little bit, and then move into the design. I'm going to talk about some design elements that I feel are key. We'll move on to activity-based counts. I'll explain what those are and provide you with a few examples. It's certainly not going to be an exhaustive list, but we will talk about some examples of those. And then we'll move into a discussion of big data. I'll actually talk about a specific example that we used and how we used data to solve a problem for us. Then finally at the end we'll have a question and answer period, but as I always caution you, if the questions get too tough, it'll just end up being a question period. So try to toss in a couple of easy ones for me. So on to the definitions. I thought we'd start with the definition of the difference between measurement and control, just kind of level set for everybody. And I looked first for a definition of measurement. I didn't find one in APICS dictionary, so maybe that's something we need to get added at some point, but I did find one in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, and it defines measurement as a figure, extent, or amount obtained by measuring. Moving on then to control, this is in the APICS dictionary, and it is defined as comparing actual to planned performance and taking corrective action as needed to align performance with plan. Now I added the italics there because that's really the key difference between measurement and control. is that taking corrective action. If you don't take corrective action, you're not actually moving into the control phase of it. And I'm trying to make this as simple and as clear as possible because this is a very key concept that I want everyone to get a very clear understanding of it. And this is one of those things where it's very easy when we first start talking about it in the abstract form, everybody seems to understand it. But then as we move on into real life, it gets more difficult. And I think the biggest mistake that I see people make is that they get caught up in measurement and see measurement as the end game rather than as a stepping stone. Now sometimes this occurs, let's be quite honest about it, is that measuring is the easy part. Identifying what you have to control and how to control it is the hard part. And so I think that's where people get hung up on hung up with just getting stuck at measurement because it's so much easier to do. So let's move on just to a very high, simple, quick example. Let's assume that I have a part number that I'm counting every month. And in the first month, my on-hands are indicating that I should have 10. I go out there, I find that I only have 8 when I count it, and so I adjust my inventory down 2 pieces. Next month, my on-hand is supposed to be 8. I only count 6, adjust my inventory down another 2 pieces. Third month, same type of thing. I'm supposed to have 6 pieces on hand. The count indicates that I have 4. And so again, I adjust my inventory down 2. Now, very clearly, we're not in control at this point. All we have done so far is measure our inventory. Control only occurs once we get into the root cause. And so at this point, we would have to start looking at what is the root cause of the discrepancies that we're finding each month. You know, is it something where we may have unauthorized withdrawals? You know, for example, somebody could be coming in and taking material out of the inventory for sales samples. It's possible that you have theft. Another possibility would be that you have picking transactions that are occurring, but they're not decrementing your inventory as they should be. So again, at this point, we really don't know anything until we really start digging into the root cause and figure out what exactly has happened. Why are we continuing to lose 2 pieces month after month? And I put this on a separate slide because it's that important to me. We want our measurements to be complete. They must be complete. Now, just as kind of a wild example, I guess, if you went into an eye doctor and he measured only one of your eyes and told you, you know what, it's not time for me to measure the other one, so I'm only going to send you home with a prescription for the one eye, I think you might really start to question if you got the right eye doctor, you know, if he's doing the right things for you, because he's not taking a complete measurement. However, I would suggest to you that this is exactly what we end up doing in a lot of cycle count programs where they focus on individual bins. And I've seen quite a number of cycle count programs where we have product that's stored in more than one bin. And quite often what happens is that we count the first bin because that's in the aisle that we're currently counting. And the other bins may be in later, scheduled later because they're not nearby to that first bin. And that's a very poor practice. You know, just in the same way that your eyes work together, your bins work together. If you have material stored in multiple places, you want to get a complete measurement of what you have in your warehouse before you take any further action. If you don't do that, what ends up happening is that it's very easy to either over-order or under-order material, and you end up creating a whiplash effect into your supply chain. where you're in a constant mode of either having too much inventory on hand or you're having to expedite material into your warehouse to cover customer back orders or stock out situations because you didn't get that complete measurement and that complete picture. So if you're working within a cycle count program, make sure that you include all of the bins within your warehouse where that material is stored. If it's stored in multiple locations, include those counts all at the same time so that you get that complete measurement. And that was one of the things I was trying to point out in the article, is that your measurements have to be complete. And if we learned nothing else from the Breaking Bad TV series, it would be that you do not want to have half measures. As Mike Armentrout, if you're familiar with the Breaking Bad TV series, very clearly pointed out that half measures lead to very bad consequences. So being a big Breaking Bad fan, I had to work that into the equation here today. So let's move on to the paradigm shift that I had mentioned earlier. What you want to get to or get from is that cycle counting and inventory control practices are an expensive activity, and they actually drive costs in your organization. And you want to get to a thought process in your organization where your cycle counts and your inventory control practices are seen as value added and a differentiator in your marketplace. Now, I'll be quite honest with you, this is not a very easy shift to make. And this was something, this is still something that we constantly fight within the record accuracy group as you get new people that come in that may not be familiar with that, may have seen very poorly designed cycle count programs and inventory control practices in the past, and they have a very negative attitude towards cycle count programs and inventory control practices. And so what you need to do is to start to shift the conversation away from cost and shift it into the conversation of what value you are adding to the organization. By doing that, over time, like I said, it's a difficult conversation in many cases, but it's a very worthwhile one that you can have. Now, one of the things that you have to be very careful of, though, is that your cycle count program and your inventory control practices are value added. If you are doing activities that don't add value to the organization, and maybe they're things that you're doing simply because you've always done them that way, or that was how it was designed before I got here and everybody's comfortable with it, you may need to go in and start tweaking your own program and start looking for areas of how you can add value into the organization. And then once you're able to do that, the conversation itself gets much, much easier over time as you have those value-added activities to be able to point to and can very clearly show where you have added value in the past. So, from what I've seen, the causes of negative attitudes towards cycle counting tend to be because people have done over-counting or over-auditing or have very poorly designed cycle count programs that really don't seem to have any awareness or of how the warehouse works or of what things may be providing value to people within the warehouse. In a nutshell, they're simply wasteful activities. And I think that's what people are tending to respond to when they have negative attitudes toward a cycle count program or toward an inventory control program. Now, I've actually heard people go so far as to say that every single counting activity is a waste, it's wasteful, and I would absolutely disagree with that comment. A count is simply a measurement. And if all we're doing is measuring, then yep, I certainly would have to agree that may be a wasteful activity, or is a wasteful activity. However, if you're taking that measurement and using it to provide some root cause analysis, or even if you're just using that measurement because it provides some type of useful information, then that is adding value to your organization. You know, as during my example in a couple of slides earlier, where I was going out and counting 1A1 every month, that's probably excessive in most situations. You know, but I've seen cycle count programs that do this type of thing, where they go out and count the same part number every month or every week, and they're not finding discrepancies. In fact, that part number may be slow moving, and there's not been any new receipts or any new orders on it either. And in that case, I actually have to agree. That's not providing you any new information. It's not providing you with any new value. And so in those cases, yes, maybe you need to look at tweaking your cycle count program into something that's more value added. Now, however, if I go out and I count that part number once a year and it provides me with a validation that that inventory is still accurate, that's not wasteful. That has just provided me with some useful information, something that I can take to an auditor and say, yes, I'm still comfortable that we have the inventory on hand that matches up with our stock records. And so that's what you're trying to look for. If you do this correctly, you get a lot of very positive benefits and things that you can point to during the discussion on how your cycle count program is working properly and providing value to you. For example, if you have a greater degree of accuracy, you're going to reduce the stockouts that you have, and as a consequence, you can reduce your safety stock. In many cases, safety stock is used not only to provide a hedge against variability in demand, but it's also used as a hedge against inventory inaccuracy. And what we end up doing is that since we're not quite sure if I've got 9 pieces or 10 or 11, you know, maybe I'm short, and so if I'm short, I probably need to carry a little bit extra just to cover that, and so maybe we carry an average of 12 pieces instead of the 10 that we could get by with, and so we add inventory, and as everybody knows, inventory is an expense, and in a lot of businesses, it's one of the largest expenses of the business. So the greater accuracy you have, the less safety stock that you can carry, the less cost you've added into the business. And this actually can end up helping to fund your cycle count program and your inventory control practices, because you're saving the company money by having that higher level of inventory accuracy. It also increases your warehouse efficiency. I've seen warehouses where they may have the inventory, we're not quite sure where it's located, and so I've seen some warehouses where they just do Herculean efforts to run around the warehouse to try to locate it so that they don't end up with the stock out, and they have to try to find that inventory as quickly as possible to meet the customer's demand. And so they spend a lot of time and effort looking around for the material. That's really a very poor practice. It makes your warehouse costs go up again, because instead of being able to go directly to the bin and having a very high likelihood that that material is there, you may have to go to 3 or 4 or 5, 6 different bins trying to find that material. All of that is time, all of that is cost, and all of that activity is wasteful. So really what you want to try to get down to is to have a very boring warehouse, because if your accuracy is very high, quite honestly, your warehouse will be pretty boring, because you're going to go to the bin, the material is going to be there, you're going to be able to fill your customer order, and that's what you want. You know, quite honestly, that should be your goal, is to make your warehouse about as boring as possible. Now, I just recently read an article about Target and some issues that they were having with their Canadian warehouses, where they had inaccurate stock records due to quantity package errors. And I'm not picking on Target, just using them as an example here of some of the issues that this led to, because in what they were finding is that they may have had a package quantity that listed the number of shirts in a package as 12 per box, where in actuality they only had 6 per box. And this, really illustrates how not having that inventory accuracy can impact you, because what ended up happening then, of course, is you have customer stockouts. They're not able to have all of the material on the shelf that they had anticipated. So when the customers come to the store, it may not be there. And that was what they were finding. So certainly they would want to get back to it being pretty boring, where they've got all their package quantities perfect, so they know exactly what they have in their warehouse. They know what they're able to put on the shelf. Because one of the things that can immediately happen with that is, when the customer goes there and finds that that material is not available to them, very likely in a situation like that where you're dealing with material that people have a very short attention span on, they're very likely to go to the next retailer and may go ahead and purchase. And if you have a customer who perceives any advantage with one of your customers, maybe that's in better service or better quality or a better price, you may have a very difficult time in winning those customers back. You're going to spend a significantly more amount of money trying to lure them back into becoming loyal customers with you again than you would have spent had you had that inventory on the shelf and knew where it was. So let's talk a little bit about cycle counting. A cycle count at its core is just all about measurement. That's really the fundamental basis of it. And purely from an auditor standpoint, that's what it is. It's a measurement. They want to know, do your stock records match your physical inventory? So that's the bare minimum. What you need to do is to go to the next 2 steps if you really want to get some benefit out of a cycle count program, and that should be that you're using it to assist in your root cause evaluation and also assist in developing corrective actions. And then when you get those corrective actions, that's where you get into your control. And what you need to do is, at the bottom of the slide there, is that every identified root cause eventually should have some sort of mitigating control over that. Now I want to talk about design of a cycle count program, and I didn't want to go into any type of an exhaustive list. Certainly you can do searches on Google and find a lot of information about cycle counting and a great deal of information about the proper cycle for your type of industry, and I thought that might be a bit too broad. And so what I wanted to do here instead was to try to talk about some design elements that I feel are very key and in some cases are overlooked. So I'm going to walk down through each one of these and give you a little bit more of an explanation of exactly what I meant by these. So the first one is making sure that you include all of the bins within your warehouse. And what this means is that you don't want to leave any black holes where inventory errors can hide. You need to be very leery if you're out in the warehouse and somebody says, hey, don't look over there, don't include these particular aisles, they're not important. Or the other thing that I have seen is when you start to look at your stock records, it is possible in a lot of software packages to create virtual locations. These are locations that don't actually correspond to a physical location, and I have seen in some cases where people will move inventory that they can't find. They'll hide it over in that location. The 999 location in SAP was a pretty common one where this could be done, and then they'll block that inventory and they're like, hey, I'm going to go back and find that later when I got time. And like a lot of us, what happens is they don't always necessarily have time, and so you have to be thinking about it not only within physical storage bins, but also be taking into account virtual storage locations on the stock records where things may have been moved, and there may either be an intentional attempt to try to hide that material, or in some cases, like I said, it can be unintentional where they mean to come back and search for that inventory, but they lose track of it because they get busy with the day-to-day operations. The second thing would be to include all of the part numbers in your warehouse, and this includes part numbers that become active during the year. One of the things I see with a lot of cycle count programs that I think is a very poor design is that as part numbers become active during the year, they're not included within the cycle count program for that year. They wait until the following year. And in my opinion, you're missing an opportunity, because what you want to do is to try to start taking getting measurements and taking measurements as early on in the life cycle of that part number, so that you can identify if there are any issues early. You think about it, if your cycle count program is on the calendar year and runs January through December, if you add a brand new part number in January, in most cycle count programs it's not picked up until the next January, and so you've essentially missed the first year of that part number's life cycle to have any type of validation. So you should look at some way of trying to figure out how you identify those part numbers earlier on and are able to include them within your cycle count program. Excuse me. The next thing that I recommend is that you look at this as a part number level, not as a bin level cycle count program. One style of cycle count programs that I have seen is where the bin is marked as being complete rather than the part number, and I think those are very poorly designed programs, because again, most of us live in a very very fast-paced world, high volume, high velocity, and what can happen is that bin may be used a dozen or more times in a year if you're extremely high volume, for different part numbers. And so if you mark it as, hey, I went and checked that bin in January, so I'm not going to check it again until next year, you may have missed a number of other opportunities where that bin has stored different material and it should have been included in a validation at some point along the year. The next thing is having an escalating approval level for high dollar adjustments. Good control practices require more than one signature. I'll tell you, I once had a new staff member come to me, and they brought in a high dollar adjustment, and they said, hey, just go ahead and sign this. And when I asked for more information, the first response I got was, hey, my old supervisor just signed these without looking at them. So first off, not a way to differentiate yourself with your new boss. Not a recommended approach there, but certainly the second thing is I saw that we had some control issues here, where I wanted some additional information before I was going to put my signature on that to write that off. Plus, as I had been looking through some of the history of it, I saw where quite often we were writing off material, high dollar material, and finding it, 6 weeks, a month later or so. And as I mentioned earlier, that can have quite a whiplash effect on your inventory. So as I started pushing back on that and saying, hey, find out a little bit more information or go do this check or that check, what I ended up finding was that the high dollar adjustments started to dry up. To the point where I was actually got a little concerned that maybe they were chunking them up into smaller adjustments and hiding them from me, So I actually went out and started looking at that type of thing too. And again, and as a supervisor, you should be doing that type of thing, is looking at the adjustments in total also, so that you don't have somebody that's trying to slip by a little bit, just underneath the threshold. And unfortunately, in this case, that didn't happen. We were getting better control. We had better processes in place, and part of that was as a result of that starting to push back on the high dollar adjustments. I would also recommend that you have some type of a recount policy that needs to include both dollar values and a percentage of your average inventory check. anytime you have high dollar adjustments, you need to recheck those. There needs to be some type of a revalidation of the inventory. You don't want to take just the first count. You want to go out and do a second check. You may want to check old locations to see has material accidentally been restored in a location where it's no longer valid for it. But also I would look at percentage of average inventory as one of your checks. It may be that is a small dollar item, but if it's 100% of what you normally carry, that can have a very large impact on your customers. And so you want to have some type of a validation. And just to toss out one example with that is that if you've lost 100% of a recent receipt would be the type of thing that you may be able to find that. It may be that it's been misstored or misplaced. It may still be on the receiving dock and somebody electronically has stored it in the bin but didn't physically. You have a better chance of catching those type of things early on. And of course I saved the best for last, which I said earlier. You want to check all of the bins where part 1A1 is stored. They need to be counted, reconciled, adjusted all at once, no half measures, always get a complete measurement. So let's talk a little bit about activity-based counts here. And I threw out 3 different kinds. This absolutely is not an exhaustive list. I didn't want to do that. But I did want to give you an idea of just a few things that you may want to look at. And certainly you may have to decide what type of things make sense for your particular industry, but let's run through these 3. So the first one is the low stock check. And an example of this would be counting all the stock where you have less than 5 on hand. And I included this in my article, and after the article was published, my boss came to me and said, hey, first off, great article. And second off, why did you put this example in there? So apparently I didn't differentiate myself too well, so I'm hoping that today that I can redeem myself with an explanation and explaining it a little bit farther, because it was a little bit difficult to fully explain what I was talking about and what the pitfalls are within a limited space that I had within the article. But what we're talking about here is that you would go out and you may take a particular area within your warehouse and say, I'm going to count all of the stock that's less than 5 on hand. And the reason you might do that is because it's very easy to do that. People can generally count to 5 very quickly. You can actually visually see whether or not you have 5 very easily. And so you can identify accuracy issues very, very quickly. It also is very quick and easy to correct those inventory stock levels. But the thing that needs to happen is that you don't stop there again. You need to move on to identifying root cause and developing control processes around this. The issue that I have, this is the reason my boss brought this up, that he was a bit concerned that I even mentioned this, was because, as I said earlier, when you get the abstract explanation of measurement and control, it's like, yep, it makes sense. In fact, people start to kind of glaze over or roll their eyes at you like, yeah, I got it. But when you get into real life, this is one of these examples where it becomes very easy for people to suddenly get confused. And they start confusing the measurement, which is the counting of the inventory, with actually controlling the inventory. And what ends up happening then is they fall in love with counting, and so, hey, if it's a good idea to count less than 5 on hand, hey, maybe I'll count less than 10 or less than 20 or whatever, and it starts to snowball, and the measurement process that we're doing, the counting of less than 5 on hand, becomes the control. Or it actually is seen as being a control process when it's clearly not. So we need to make sure that if you do these type of counts, it needs to be seen as, hey, I'm going to help you to clean up your inventory, and we're going to use this as a time where we identify what the root problems are. And you need to be very clear with people up front that this is a short-term measure, It's focused on getting what the root cause is. Empty bin validations is another type of activity-based count. And theoretically, I absolutely love this particular concept. In practicality, it's not been as good as what I thought it was going to be. And essentially what I'm talking about here is that at picking time, you have your picker validate that the bin is empty systematically as well as physically. And the purpose of this is to prevent mixed stock, because if you had material that remained in that bin but's not on your stock records, it is possible for new material to be stored in that bin, and somebody may not notice that the material is different within that bin, and they may just store the new material over the top of the old material, especially if you have similar box types or it's similar in appearance in some way. The second thing is this helps you to find lost stock. You may have written off material earlier, and now somehow, it always amazes me, but somehow it finds its way back to the bin at times, and this is one way where you can do that. The third thing I like about it is that if it is systematically as well as physically empty at the same time, you essentially have a stake in the ground of your inventory accuracy at that point. It's like doing a balance of your checkbook, which I'm not sure that anybody actually does anymore, but if you did, it essentially would be like doing that monthly balance where now you know that your inventory is accurate at that particular point. Now, the issues that we have seen, and this is why I said, you know, theoretically I absolutely love this idea, but in practicality, the issues that we have ended up running into are that we find ourselves in a constant retraining mode. People, for whatever reason, get confused on it. Am I confirming a quantity before I picked or after I picked? And so what we find is that there's one piece that they're picking out of the bin. That's the last piece. And instead of confirming that the bin is empty after that, they end up confirming that I have one piece, and as if it was found inventory. So that's one of the things that we have found that's been an issue. The other is that on our high bins or low bins, these would be things where you'd have to take an extra step to make sure that they're truly empty. We unfortunately find that people are not as good at double checking those, and so what happens sometimes is that they won't get up on a step ladder, they won't kneel down to see if those bins are truly empty. And I think what we find here is that people are very good at doing one thing at a time. We all like to think that we're good at multitasking, but none of us really are that good at multitasking, and I think that's why our people struggle with this one also. Okay, so the other type of activity-based count would be to identify targeting problem-prone areas. So this would be aisles or storage types that, you know, for example, you are having a high level of bin denials or stockouts in a certain area. And so you would go and you would specifically target those areas. And again, the idea here is you're going to go in, count the inventory in that particular area. What you're doing is, instead of trying to go out and fix your entire warehouse, you go out and you target specific areas that are your worst areas. That's where you're going to get your biggest bang for your buck. And then you correct the inventory inaccuracies there. And then, again, and I know I harp on this point over and over again, identify the root causes. Why were they inaccurate to start with? And then develop the control processes. Again, the issue that I often see with this one is, excuse me, the confusion of measurement and control again, and the cleanup gets to be seen as the control activity. And as I mentioned earlier, quite honestly, this occurs because counting is so much easier than dealing with issues. You know, if you have people in the warehouse and it's a systemic issue where they're creating the inaccuracy issues, you have a lot of work to do to try to go back and try to break some of the bad habits, whereas counting just seems kind of easier than dealing with personnel problems at times. And so I think that's where you have to guard against that. So let's move on now to big data. And I threw out a few examples here. Absolutely not an exhaustive list, but I'm going to run through it just a little bit about this. I'm sure that in your own industries you can identify plenty of other opportunities for yourself. But the first one I want to talk about is gross adjustments. And gross adjustments is the absolute value of all of your inventory adjustments. This is a very quick indicator of control. And one of the first Six Sigma projects that I ever ran identified very quickly that the worse your gross adjustment number, the worse or less control that you had. So all of our poorly performing warehouses had significantly higher gross inventory adjustments, and the strong performing warehouses that had very low stockouts, low claim activity, low evidence of shrinkage, all had very low gross adjustments. So it's a very quick indicator, kind of the canary in the mine shaft. You know, if you start seeing your gross adjustments increase, I would immediately go out and start trying to figure out what else is going on, what other type of issues do you have, because it's what you're having is a lot of activity, a lot of inventory adjustments being made, but you do not have control in that warehouse, and so you need to jump into some other additional data to try to figure out what's happening. So again, you know, what I would suggest is that you take your data, slice and dice it different ways, and when I use the word accuracy here, you could substitute anything from high level of stockouts to a high level of claims, a high level of shrinkage. Whatever type of accuracy issue you're having, these are the type of things that you may want to take it against and start running up your data against these type of other factors. You know, so you may want to say, okay, I have a very high level of stockouts, and I want to look at that by storage type, for example, or by storage elevation. You know, maybe you have an issue where people don't want to climb up on the ladder and, you know, and check to see is the inventory all the way to the back of that bin, and so they just mark it down as no, I don't have it because visually I couldn't see it, so it must not be there. But the stock records still indicate that you have the material. So the purpose of this would be that what you're trying to do is limit your scope. Let's be quite honest about it. We cannot go out and fix everything in the warehouse all at once. And so what you want to try to do is get to the point where you chunk up your warehouse into smaller sections and target each one of those sections and fix what you can in that particular area and gain control of that particular area. And this is just a very simple chart that we have used to identify where stockouts occur in the warehouse. And the thing that I like about this type of a chart is that it's very easy for everyone to understand. You know, not only people on the floor, but you could take this up through management. You could take this all the way up through upper management. Everybody understands red, green, and yellow. Just instinctively, we all understand that red's bad, yellow's marginal, and green is good. You know, it's just something that's been drilled into us all along that when you get to red, you need to stop, and then you need to figure out what action needs to be taken next. And so this would be the type of thing that you can do is to put together a very quick stoplight chart like this where you can very quickly see that, okay, I've got a couple of areas that are red, and so maybe those are the areas that I want to look at a little bit more closely. Now, just a caution with this, the next thing you need to do is look at volume, because you may have something where an area of your warehouse is red, but you only filled 10 tags from there last week, and so you could fix that area and make it absolutely perfect, and you're really not going to move the needle much. You know, especially if you had another area that may be yellow, but you filled 100,000 orders in that particular area. So you have to use a little bit of common sense with this too, and also put your numbers together. But what you're clearly trying to do is chunk up the warehouse into manageable sections and then target those specific areas for your root cause and corrective action. Now, I do want to save some time for question and answer here, so this is the last slide we're going to be getting to. This is an example that we used with a client that had very high levels of stock out rate, and they were very unhappy that their stock out rate was so high. And so what we did was we started doing exactly what I talked about in the last few slides, is we went out and started pulling data by area of the warehouse, and very quickly identified that there were 3 areas that were the most poorly performing, and we thought, here's the areas where we could get the biggest bang for our buck. So the first one, the tire area, we found was very poorly performing, and what we found in this particular area was that it's an unusual storage type. Tires are not something that a lot of places normally stock, and it was only a very small piece of their business overall as far as volume within the warehouse. And but we were finding a significant number of stockouts were coming from this area. And what was happening was they just had very poor storage practices in there. So the material was there, the tires were there, but they were not located in a clean, neat, easy way for people, for the picker to quickly identify that, yep, I can go find 2 of these tires that match. You may be able to find one, but had to dig through to try to find the second one, and in a lot of cases, you know, got tired of doing that, and so he would just indicate, you know, nope, I can't find the second one. Because the pickers are, of course, are on metrics where they need to pick so much per hour. They don't really have time to start digging through to see, you know, is that material there. So one of the first things that we had to do was to identify storage guidelines for the people who were putting away the material on how that needed to be put away, so that it would be easier for the picker to come along and find that material, locate it quickly. He wasn't going to have to spend time digging through a bin area, you know, and hopefully find that second tire at the bottom of that bin. Instead, they were more organized to the point where it was very easy and quick for him to find. Similar thing with the elongated rack area, which in this case, these are unusually shaped items. And again, we found people weren't quite sure how to store them, and so they did the best that they could. But what ended up happening was that they would not get stored exactly correctly. They may get pushed into a bin near to them, get pushed to the back of the rack where people, again, could not see them, couldn't find them, that type of thing. And so, again, we had to develop storage guidelines for that, make it easier for the picker when they were coming along to actually be able to find that material. Now, the last thing I thought was probably the most interesting, at least to me, was the small parts bins. What we found here was that we had a client that thought that there was a competitive advantage to storing their small parts, and what I'm talking about here is like nuts and bolts and washers, screws, loose packed items. They thought there was a competitive advantage in their industry to have them as loose packed and not to force somebody, as you know, if we go out and buy a package of nuts or bolts from Walmart, you generally don't get to buy 2 bolts. You get to buy a package of 10, you know, and Walmart's decided that you really want 10. This particular customer had decided that, no, they were going to give their customers the flexibility of only ordering 2 if that's really what they wanted. The problem with that was that in some cases their customers were ordering quantities of maybe 90 or 100 or 200, and so what happened was that since they weren't readily packaged and readily able to be identified that, hey, I need to pick 10 packages of 10, they would have to pour out the small parts onto their carts and then count out 100 or 200. And what invariably happened with this was that some of these would roll. They may roll under previously picked material, and they didn't notice that. Or when they were trying to dump them back into the bin, they may drop 1 or 2 and they bounce, and who knows where they bounce to. And so as we got down to lower quantities, we found that what was ended up happening is that they had lost those last couple of pieces. And so what we did, initially we did talk to them about, maybe it's time to put these in package quantity where they'll be better controlled. However, like I said, this client didn't want to do that. And so here's one of these ideas where I wish I could have taken the credit for it, but somebody else came up with the idea of the addition of pill trays on each one of the picking carts so that those the pickers could put the material, much like they do on at your pharmacy, where they dump out what looks like maybe 100 pills, and then they count them out, 2 by 2. They did the same thing with the nuts and bolts and screws and washers. They put them on a pill tray, count out the 100 pieces. Very easy then to put the remaining ones back into the bin. The lost material dropped significantly. And we actually ended up with a result of a 50% reduction in stockouts for that particular client, which was a very significant start on their journey. So, like I said, I did want to save some time for question and answer. I also have my contact information here in case there's other questions afterwards you would like to contact me about. That would be fine to do that also. And Chris, I'll throw it back over to you in case you have questions that came in.
Yes, thanks, Andrew. I do have some questions. And as a brief reminder, if you want to ask a question, please look at the questions box on the right toolbar on your screen and just click send after you ask your question. So we have some great ones here. This one's from Caitlin. Regarding accuracy versus receipt quantity, how important is it to count all materials at receival?
That is a great question. And to some degree that's going to depend on the type of relationship that you have with your vendors. My opinion on it, though, is that I would recommend that at least initially you start off with counting everything that's coming in and validating everything that's coming in. What you'll find in a lot of cases is that there are discrepancies, especially with certain vendors, and if they are thinking that they are not being held accountable, and they're shorting you, or they're just maybe shipping possibly even extra, it may happen more like you're going to get short. They're not going to be as accurate. So I think it's very important that you validate everything that comes in. You start to get into the law of diminishing returns as you get into very, very high quantity items. If you have things like I mentioned, the nuts and the bolts and washers, typically you're going to be buying those in bulk quantities. And in that case, it may be okay to do a scale count to get a reasonable effort. Because let's be quite honest about it, none of us can count up to 10,000 accurately. If you try to do that, you're going to have some error factor in that anyway. But certainly, as you get smaller quantities, absolutely validate those, especially with the smaller quantities where it's very quick and easy to validate the counts.
All right, moving right along, this next question comes from Lawrence, and this question is, do you recommend counting the high-value items more often than the rest? And how often is often?
Well, I know that there's been some research done on that, which actually indicates that high-value items tend to be more accurate than our low-value items. And I believe the thought is a couple of things. One, we tend to have greater control of our high-value items. And the second thing is that we tend to have fewer of them, right? If you have a high-dollar item, whatever that means, if it's a $100,000 item, then that's what you consider high dollar, you probably don't have hundreds of those type of items. You may only have one or two. And so it's much less likely that you're going to be inaccurate on those. Certainly you need to have some type of a validation on those items. And one of the other, so I would say at least, if you're looking at a cycle count program, I do believe at least a once a year validation of those would be reasonable. Part of it is also going to depend on the type of high dollar item. Is it something that's pilferable or theft prone, and especially if it's something that's very easy to steal. For example, my wife used to work in the jewelry industry, and diamonds are certainly a high value item, and they're very, very small, very, very expensive. Those are the type of things that could be very easily stolen, very easily taken out of a store. And those type of things, you want to check those much more frequently. A weekly basis is probably not too often. However, if you're talking about something, we have a cat mining truck, for example, that's worth $1 million. That's a high value item. Not too likely that somebody's going to be able to walk away with that. It's not something that they can put in their purse or the lunchbox or drive around without any type of notice. So you have to understand what your industry is, and I think that the theft-prone part of it is where you really need to make the distinction.
All right, thanks. And our next question is, do you think it would be best to count after a sale or after the product has been manufactured, or both?
Whether you should count after the sale or after the manufacture, I'm not sure that it really makes any difference either way, to be honest with you. I guess I'm not quite sure where that question is coming from. Because if you're doing a cycle count program, typically you would have a cycle of when that material needs to be counted, and hopefully if you're in a manufacturing situation, you're considering your work in process along the way, and also including that within any type of an inventory validation process that you have. So I'm not sure that it would really make too much difference either way.
All right. Well, I think we have time for either one longer question or two quick ones. Let's see how this one goes. This one's from Bia. If a warehouse consistently has 99.99% accuracy, and warehouses are counted at least 9 times per year per audit requirements, do you think it's still necessary to count at least 9 times per year?
I think that gets back to exactly what I was saying earlier, is you start looking at what the value is. Are you adding value? In this case, it sounds like we may be counting a bit too frequently, and I'm not sure that those additional counts are adding value. Maybe what you want to spend more time on, in my opinion, would be making sure that you've got the control practices in place, well documented, which it sounds like you must, if you've got inventory accuracy that high. And I think you want to spend a little bit more time on making sure that the inventory control practices are strong and remain strong.
All right, great. And I think one more quick one here. This one came from several people, so I'll just ask the most recent one. Are your own cycle counting staff, are they dedicated on-site, or are they outsourced personnel?
We have dedicated staff, and the reason that we do that is because we have found that they're most familiar with the product, and we also can train them and get greater control over what they know and what we want them to know. One of the things that I see, if you have contract staff, there tends to be a bit more turnover with that. You get people who are not necessarily as familiar with your product, and that can actually introduce more error into a cycle count program, and so it can be somewhat problematic for you if you have people that are not familiar. And there's a lot of things. Counting seems like it ought to be really, really easy. But it's not as easy as what people think, and I've always recommended that people go out and do it for a few hours, and you'll find out exactly what I'm talking about. When you get into things, for example, like package quantity, it's very easy to misunderstand how things are packaged. I can remember from my own past experiences. I worked at a paper company at one point, and all of the white paper was always sold by the case. paper that was of various colors was sold by the ream, and very easy to make picking errors on that if you were brand new and didn't understand that distinction. And same thing on the counting. It would be very easy to make counting errors on that if you're starting to count a package of colored paper as if it was one container when it was actually 12 packages in that particular box. So I think you're better off having dedicated staff that really understand exactly what your business is.
All right, and with that, Andrew, I think we're just about at our time, so I want to thank you once again for your participation in this webinar.
All right, thank you very much.
And for all our registrants and our participants today, thank you so much for attending. This concludes today's edition of APICS Extra Live. All content and materials included in this edition of APICS Extra Live are the property of APICS and Andrew C. Stein and are protected by the United States and international copyright laws. All rights are reserved.